This investigation is part one of an ongoing reporting partnership by NBC News and the Global Reporting Center on Global Supply Chains. Read part 2 here. Monica, Steve Crizin, 64, remembers the nights in Appalachia when steel was king. Back in the 1970s, more than 60% of the workforce in Beaver County, Pennsylvania, was tied to steel, and Appalachia was the industry's beating heart. Its streets were lined with tidy houses and busy shops, and when the day shift ended, its bars were packed full of steel workers with flush pockets. Appalachia was booming, said Crizin, then a steel worker. But when the layoffs started, he said, it was the first hint of what would become a regional catastrophe, the collapse of the steel industry. It seemed like once it started, it snowballed, said Crizin. In this case it's steel, but it doesn't matter what it is. If a business that supported a town collapses, it's devastating. Today, just a 10-minute drive away, a new industry is rising from the banks of the Ohio River. Royal Dutch Shell's multi-billion-dollar ethane cracker, an industrial complex that heats ethane, a component of natural gas, and cracks it into ethylene, a building block for plastic. Crizin, who found a second career in commercial trucking, is now one of the approximately 8,000 temporary laborers who report daily to the cracker. He transports fuel, driving across the massive complex to supply an average of 10,000 gallons per day. When it launches in 2022, the Pennsylvania Petrochemicals Complex will make some 1.6 million metric tons yearly of what many say the world needs less of: the plastic pellets that will become plastic products, from sports gear to shrink wrap. Samples of the plastic pellets that Royal Dutch Shell produce at their plant in Beaver County, Rossmantle, NYT via Redix file. It will also be Appalachia's first ethane cracker. Far from the petrochemical manufacturing facilities that line the Gulf Coast, the region where coal and steel once reigned is perhaps an unlikely home for the cracker. But in recent years, states have offered more than $1 billion in economic incentives to lure plastic projects to a region where hydraulic fracking has produced an abundance of cheap natural gas. In 2012, Pennsylvania's leaders bet big on Shell be authorizing a tax credit worth about $1.65 billion for ethylene projects. The tax credit was assigned to industry that the public sector was able to be a good partner, said Mark Thomas, president of the Pittsburgh Regional Alliance, a nonprofit economic development group. Shell's cracker, he added, is a long-term play that many hope will spark more regional growth. The economic multiplier associated with these employment and contracting opportunities will be apparent for decades, Curtis Smith, a Shell spokesperson, wrote in a statement. But others, including some residents and advocates, fear that amid the climate crisis and a global plastics glut, such projects are not just risky investments, but the wrong choice for a region still struggling to rebound from the toxic legacy of its industrial past. We've seen this for generations, said Rob Altenberg, director of the Energy Center at Penn Future, an environmental advocacy group. They come in, they take profits, the industry goes away, and it leaves Pennsylvania taxpayers holding the bag for not only the economic impacts of this but also the public health impacts. We're doing the same thing with Shell, he added, ignoring the carbon pollution that they're putting out and effectively giving them money to pollute. Related. Interactive. Part 2, How Public Subsidies Help to Hold Up the Plastics Industry. Published in partnership with the Global Reporting Center. Why Appalachia? Over the past decade, facing unstable oil prices and uncertain demand for fossil fuels, companies like Shell and ExxonMobil have turned toward plastic, nearly all of which is produced by chemicals derived from crude oil or natural gas. The industry was trying to determine, okay, if we can't make money with oil and gas extraction in the way that we could 20 years ago, and the refinery business has become increasingly competitive and increasingly unprofitable, what is our future? Said Kathy Hippold, senior researcher at the Ohio River Valley Institute, a progressive regional think tank, and a finance professor at Bard College's MBA in Sustainability program. Plastics or petrochemicals were seen as a lifeline. The industry's pivot, fueled in part by cheap natural gas unlocked by the fracking boom, has led to a proliferation of plastics manufacturing. The industry has poured tens of billions into plastics projects in the U.S., according to a report released last month by Bennington College and Beyond Plastics, an advocacy group dedicated to ending plastics pollution. Ethylene manufacturing capacity in the U.S. has grown to 45 million tons per year since 2005, a 69% increase. Most of that buildup has occurred on the Gulf Coast in Texas and Louisiana, where so-called fence-line communities have long lived pressed against petrochemical complexes, and where plastic manufacturers have recently faced intense scrutiny and civil penalties for air and water. But the industry also set its sights on Appalachia. The region is closer to East Coast manufacturers and awash in wet gas, which contains more of the ethane necessary to make plastic. State and federal officials have promoted the petrochemical industry as a harbinger of a regional renaissance, not only for the jobs it might bring, but for the development that could bloom in the wake of projects like Shell's cracker, from restaurants and hotels to commercial transportation. And it's not that the industry by itself will rescue all the communities that need investment, Thomas, of the Pittsburgh Lions, said, but it will create enough of a fire that it can be catalytic. Since about 2010, regional leaders have pursued at least 7 plastics-related projects. That includes an ethane cracker in Ohio and a multi-state mega-complex called the Appalachian Storage and Trading Hub, which would include hundreds of miles of pipeline and underground storage for natural gas and petrochemicals. To attract industry, states have offered tax credits, grants, loans and other incentives worth about $1.7 billion. But for as much money as has been promised or spent, Shell's Beaver County cracker is so far the only plastics-related project to break ground. It will produce both low and high-density polyethylene for use in consumer items like food packaging, shampoo bottles and housewares. According to Shell, it will produce about 600 permanent jobs.